Good afternoon, everyone. Well, it's afternoon where I'm sitting in a rather chilly London, although it's now March and I don't think we've seen any much sun this month as we normally do. My name's David Bellingham. I'm Programme Director of the Master's Degree in Art Business at Sotheby's Institute of Art. And this is my podcast called The Art Business. My guest today, very exciting guest today, we've got Sebastian Duthy, who's the CEO of a web-based platform for art market data analysis called AMR, or Art Market Research. And guesting with Sebastian is Veronika Lukasova, who works with him as a researcher and senior analyst. So welcome, Veronika and Sebastian.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us on.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so I'm going to dive straight in as I usually do. I think listeners just like to know a little bit more about you and your interests, as it were. So I'm going to start by asking Veronika, do you have a favourite city, Veronika, and could you give your reasons for your choice?
I love Prague, which, I'm not trying to be sort of nepotic here, but I'm Czech. And I did not grow up in Prague, but for me, Prague has always been a really magical city and still is now. And it's got a very rich history. Lots of books I read over the, past 40 years are based in Prague. So for me, that's still a fascinating city that I'll have to go to. I'm
ashamed to say it's a place that is on my list and I haven't been to, and it's literally just time. But it's definitely a place I'd like to go to. It sounds very, very beautiful and a little bit different from maybe what I'm used to, the kind of Italian tradition and so on. And Sebastian, is yours Prague as well?
I'd say I love London. I was born here. I grew up in Islington. I have many, many good memories of London, particularly in August. I always love London in August. Something about the fact that people aren't working so much and there's a more relaxed atmosphere. So yeah, I would say that. And I spent most of my time in North London, so I love the Heath. I'd go up there a lot with friends. And also growing up in London, we just sort of we're on foot a lot of the time or on bikes. So so that's my sort of fondest memories, really.
And would you say that London has changed in the new millennium from what it was before the new millennium?
Well, I tell you what, everyone had a different experience of the lockdown and the pandemic. But one thing that I noticed, because we live in central London, and so I go out here, I'm not far from where I was born, actually. And the quietness on the streets was very similar to London when I grew up in the 80s, and so that was very reminiscent. But it's changed dramatically, hugely. I mean, I think it's much more multicultural than even when I was young, and it was multicultural then. But so it's just become richer, and I love it just as much. I mean, I just love I suppose the politeness of London, the kind of the sort of genteelness, and I think that's what people love about it too.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I what surprises me is that I kind of like it more now than I ever have done. I think a lot happened in the 90s in the cultural and socio-political world that made some, the opening of Tate, I always see as a sort of moment for the new millennium, the new Tate Modern and Tate. I actually took my students there on the first opening day. I remember seeing the Louis Bourgeois spider and thinking how fantastically site specific it was in a place that had been, an industrial building that had been abandoned for decades. And I think since then, a lot of what has happened to London is this great excitement and love of contemporary art and culture, which definitely wasn't there, I think. Would you agree, in the 80s and 90s? I think art and contemporary art was seen as something like piles of bricks and, I think it was seen as something quite not necessarily elitist, but difficult. And I think since the kind of new pop artists of the world like Hurst and Emin and co have come along, and Rachel White-Reid, I think it's much more exciting. I think it's made the whole city more exciting. So it's really, really sad to see all of these recent kind of cuts, I think, to the arts. I think that I can understand perhaps reasons why they're doing that and cutting London arts and putting them into the north. But I think a lot of people come and live in London, choose to live in London or work in London or put their, financial services in London, partly because of that cultural backdrop. Even if they don't go to it, people tend to say to me, I don't really have time to go to galleries. But if they weren't there, it would make London a duller place.
Well, I totally agree with I mean, I remember going to Sensation at the Royal Academy,
Yes.
and I remember it just changed everything in terms of the atmosphere. Art suddenly belonged to a younger generation. We could all sort of feel connected in some ways. Certainly, growing up in London, I felt definitely connected with that exhibition, what was going on. It was very exciting. Definitely.
Yeah. And I think I remember it being dirty. In terms of, I think the cleaning services have much improved in the late 90s and new millennium. It used, I have this kind of memory of it being quite drab, and it was still exciting. But I think all I'm trying to say is I think it's improved. You talked about living in North London and having access to the Heath, which is kind of like nature in the countryside in the city, really. But Veronika, do you like being outside of the city, or are you a kind of like a city woman, or are there any kind of rural locations you like?
Oh, yeah. I love the woods. I love the forests. That's how I spent a lot of my childhood. So I have this draw to keep going to nature, and obviously Hampstead Heath is the closest thing to it, and actually Kew Botanical Gardens as well. So we go there a lot. But I'd say the sort of the most fantastic place for natural beauty is the Sequoia National Forest. In western US, and I had a chance to revisit last summer, and it was beautiful. And in a way, it's interesting microcosm of how attitudes change. We talk about how, London changed, but in there you see how, back in the day, the trees were viewed purely as a sort of commercial kind of entity. And they were locked profusely without any concern about how many are there of them or how old are they. Nobody cared. And so, now obviously there's conservation of the whole area, but you could still see there's these massive, gigantic stumps with sort of staircase leading onto it.
Yes.
And you can stand on it and you're like, oh my God, it seems so brutal, so sort of unbelievable that somebody's done that, because, from a filter of our time, 21st century, you're like, this is just unbelievable. But I just love the notion of deep time, and I think when you stand in the middle of a forest full of giants that are 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years old, it's really humbling, and you think about what has our society done in that time since these little seedlings came into these big trees.
It's quite humbling, isn't it? Quite humbling.
Yeah,
it's quite interesting actually, because I sometimes get on the train with my dog to take her on the overground to Hampstead Heath to walk her, and I'm at Kew Gardens, and it sounds as though you are coming this way to go to the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, which I live literally 10 minutes away from. So I'm in there quite a lot. Yeah, the only problem is you can't take the dog in there, so I feel really guilty if I, to go there without her, and she kind of gives me this look. I say, I'm going to go to the gardens. I'm just going to go look at the bluebells. But no, I think you're right. I think what you're saying is that kind of almost like any woodland is a place to be, and we feel humbled by the age of. I was looking at a tree in the gardens of Chiswick House the other day, and it was 200 years old. A big cedar tree, and the Richmond Park has some very old oak trees. Also, I don't know whether you've been watching the David Attenborough series called Wild. I think it's either Wild Island or Wild Britain. At last, he's actually decided. There's a lot of nature nearer home, and it's a beautiful program. And he's talking about the percentage of the woodland that has disappeared. It's massive. We're talking 90% in some places. And I always wonder whether to watch a David Attenborough program, because it's quite depressing, and it always has like animals sort of attacking and feeding on one another. But it's really, I would, listeners, if they can have a look at that, it's really nice introduction to the British Isles. There's something very small scale about Britain compared to other places I've been to, which I like miniaturist, which I find very moving. Everything is a little bit smaller, so the orchids aren't spectacular, but they're beautiful, sort of in miniature. Likewise, our Lake District mountains, they're not particularly high compared to mountains elsewhere in the world, but relatively speaking, they're incredibly beautiful and quite awe-inspiring. And Sebastian, do you have a particular rural location that you think of?
Well, I had to think about it. I mean, I knew that you were going to ask me that, because I actually had to think about that. I spent so much time in London, but I'm also fortunate enough to have spent time making films, and a recent series a few years back, we made a film about islands for the BBC, and so we went to some lots of places, Madagascar and Madeira, but my absolute favorite was Hawaii. Not for the surf and the shopping, but just the extraordinary variety of those different islands. And we were lucky enough to be taken around by the experts who were interviewing and showing us around. And I mean, some of those old forests and some of the the early growth before the kind of introduction of the invasive species, you can still find those, and they are absolutely magical. And then you can come out of a forest like that, and you'll be up towards the volcanoes, and then the temperature changes, and suddenly it feels like we're back in rural England in terms of climate, but also even the way it looks, the kind of plants. So it's just an extraordinary range. I mean, it really was fantastic. That's something I thought about going back, definitely.
Again, Hawaii is somewhere I haven't been to Sequoia, I haven't been to Hawaii, so they'll start putting these on my list. And Attenborough talked about, he was looking at some woodland in Cornwall, southwest England, and he was actually saying that they're actually rainforests. They're like miniature rainforests still down in Cornwall, particularly on the edges of the moors, which is remarkable. So music, do you care about music, Veronika, or is it just something you have in the background? Or
Well, I actually, my original study, my MA, was focused on musicology. So I'm a musicologist by degree, but I've never practiced musicology. I never sort of pursued this particular direction. But I always feel like it's given me a really, really good base for everything else I do. So when I was studying, I was completely immersed in sort of, old masters of music, I should say, Monteverdi, Pergolesi, and I still listen. I love Pergolesi's Stabat Mater. That's one of my favorite sort of music pieces of all time. But since then, I really love Phil Glass, sort of contemporary, minimalist musician. But I'm a bit of a magpie. I mean, I listen to a lot of different things, that I just sort of pick and choose and create playlists. And but also lately I listen to a lot of podcasts and audiobooks. So that's, I think, probably more than music.
Sounds not dissimilar to me, actually, because I was listening to Philip Glass the other day. Went to the Royal Ballet to see this thing about Virginia Woolf works, and the music's by this guy called Max Richter. If you haven't heard of him, you should check him out, because he's like a slightly more commercial version of Philip Glass, I would say, like as a minimalist composer.
I was going to mention him, and then
you thought no one would have heard about it. Yeah, no. So yeah. And what was the last one you said after talking about Phil Glass? Did you mention?
No, I said I was sort of a magpie. I've sort of I lived in the United States for a long time, and I really embraced sort of Motown and that whole culture.
No, I know what you said. You said you've been listening to audiobooks, and that's another thing. I got for Christmas. I got Audible as a subscription. I love it.
I absolutely love it. Right now I'm listening to the Katie Hassel's book that came out last year.
Yes, that's on my wish list.
Through women artists, it's fantastic.
Yes, that's actually probably the next one I'm going to download. As you know, you can only download one a month, and it's in my list. And what's nice about that, for example, I know it gives you a PDF version, so you can actually have the written version as well as the. But obviously, I don't know whether there are any images in the PDF version, and it's kind of quite strange listening to someone actually referring to works of art. It'd be quite interesting experience to see what it sounds like on Audible.
I do have the actual book as well.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing now, I'm kind of listening to it, and then I have it as a research sort of resource, so I can use it, you know, when I'm making presentations and so forth. So I like, sometimes I buy books in both formats just to sort of, you know, listen to it first and then know maybe which areas I'm most interested in and go back to those. So
yeah, because you really need the text in order to quote sites from it, for example.
Absolutely.
Wow. And Sebastian, are you a music lover? I'm sure you are.
Yeah, I love music. I love music. I mean, thinking of the minimalist, the composer came to mind for me was Niels Frahm. Do you know Niels Frahm?
No, I don't know Niels Frahm.
Well, yeah, he's amazing. And I saw him 2 or 3 years back at the Barbican, where he was on stage, just a piano. And they had this fantastic set where he was they created a sort of pool of water, and then a sort of bridge, and the piano was in this pool of water. And it was just him with the piano, and it was just absolutely magic. It really was. It was so memorable. But music, yes, I love, but again, all sorts of music, just good music, really. In the morning, I'll listen to Radio 3. In the afternoon, I'll be on Radio 6 music. I mean, I grew up in London with friends. We had a sound system like lots of people did, and we put on parties, and it was really when hip hop was breaking, and you know, and sort of Public Enemy and the Beastie Boys. So we were very involved with that. But also Talking Heads, you know, absolutely love Talking Heads, still do today. I think they sound incredibly modern. Saw David Byrne not so long ago, absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I would say that's the kind of music. And then also, before I was making television, I had a career editing commercials and music videos. So I worked a lot on music videos, and sometimes I hear a song. Last week I had a song that I had edited, and that's always fun, because when you're editing, you spend hours listening to the same piece over and over again. It becomes totally part of you, and so you can literally hear half a note and you are taken back to that time when you were doing it. So that's kind of fun too. But yeah, so very mixed.
I noticed you were showing a little bit of a video. I don't know if it's on your website, which explains how AMR works, your art market research works. But I noticed that it was very well edited, and I noticed there was this kind of avant-garde jazz, maybe, is the sort of playing along to it.
Yeah,
a little bit atonal.
Well, yeah, I mean, I work with music a lot. I mean, in my career, I've always worked with music, and really with documentary, it's become more now. It used to be where you would just find a piece of music for the documentary. Now editors are really working with scoring, really. So the production music you get to use is given to you in different elements, what they call stems, and so you're literally working with different parts to kind of really score the picture. Not like a proper composer, because that's too big budget, but a lot of editors are working like that now, and it's part of the way now. Really, you can't afford to lose people's attention, and so your sound and music is such an important part of filmmaking that and I absolutely love doing that. Absolutely, yeah.
And I'm right in saying that film, for example, because you've got a part, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment, but you've got a past in like editing films, so you do all that yourself. You don't have to farm that out.
Yes, we can do that here. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So that's part. So now moving towards art, Veronika, do you have I usually ask people, do you have an early memory of when you suddenly realised there was such a thing as art?
So my parents both teachers. My mom at the elementary school, my dad at university, and I think they really cultivated a lot of curiosity and a lot of creativity in us, you know, in different directions. And it was clear early on that my sister is, you know, absolutely very talented, and she went on to go to art school and then, you know, art university and so forth. I was more of a journalist. I didn't have the draft skills. I had ideas, but I didn't have the draft skills. So I remember, you know, making collages, and, you know, when I was a teenager, writing a lot of poetry and you know, I actually found some of it, and it's not bad.
Should publish it.
So it was clear to me that I was very, you know, I was finding my path to art, which then became, you know, with the help of sort of using a camera and taking photos.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that yes, we've been exposed to a lot of things. My parents were not artists, but my grandma, grandpa, they were poet and writers. So we had a lot of sort of different arts in the family.
Sure.
And I think it all sort of coalesced when I finished my degrees, moved to the United States, and basically decided I want to be a photographer, actually. So,
and we'll come back to that in a moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate asking this question, but is there a period of art or a certain artist or an actual work that if someone puts a gun against your head, or you have to take one work to a desert island, is there any artist or period or work that particularly moves you, or for whatever reason?
I mean, I love old masters.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying it because we're doing podcasts with you, David. But I'm very, very drawn to old masters, because to me, it's the way the light is expressed in these paintings. And I think that's what sets them apart. And I always, you know, it's very hard for us to sort of travel in time and imagine what the sort of circumstance and the social context was. You know, we can just read about it through sort of tales and stuff. But I feel like, you know, what I love about it is that it's natural light is what we see in the paintings. When we, you know, when the painting moved and, you know, medium developed and different light sources developed, you know, you could see that it's very different. You know, it's sort of more flat, you know, this and that outside. So I love old masters for this, you know, for the chiaroscuro and the themes and the way some of them are quite humorous as well, you know, if you really study the painting. Yeah. And I'd say one of my favorite paintings is the Two Ambassadors by Holbein.
In the National
Gallery. Because I'm very much drawn to science and sort of interdisciplinary kind of approach to arts, and I love the fact that Holbein just decided to try this new kind of you know, new trick to show viewers, actually, if you stand this side, you can see the skull, you know, in the right perspective. But I love how it's combined in this sort of painting of these sort of important ambassadors, and instead of making vanitas, you know, sort of in the corner, perhaps, you know, he decides to do it this way.
I think that painting actually, in many ways, it is one of the most remarkable works of art ever made, I think, because as you say, it's very unusual. It's a double portrait. It's a very unusual format for Holbein. But also, as you say, it's just filled with semiotic studies have been made of it. It's filled with all of these tricks and visual tricks, as you say, the anamorphic.
And there's contemporary scientific documents, tools as well, you know, which is fantastic. Yeah. So
yeah, it's tremendous, actually. It's very easy to kind of almost forget about it. But the listeners should go, if you don't know it, go to the National Gallery and spend half an hour just looking at that painting. It's quite remarkable and very, very contemporary in its kind of in a lot of what it's trying to say to you, I would say. Yeah. But your what you're saying about lights, I do get that, because sometimes you see like contemporary and ultra contemporary painting, it's very realistic, but there is something, as you say, there's something flat very often about it. There aren't that many contemporary artists I look at who are as interested and as good at light, particularly natural light, as the old master painters. And I remember in the Venice Biennale a few years ago, the one of the main things was light. And they put Tintorettos from the city of Venice, where of course he lived, in the middle of the Grand Pavilion as a, you know, so it was very interesting that the keynote was struck not by a contemporary artist, but by an old master from Venice. And Sebastian, art, do you remember this thing? Did you grow up in an artist?
Well, yes, I mean, yeah, in every direction I had art around me. I mean, this business that that I have now, that was started by my father, and so we research the art market today, but he's been doing it since the 1970s. So I grew up with large tomes with Christie's and Sotheby's on the side with their end of year results, and so I just had art all around me, and he was passionate about art, so we spent our time, you know, being central London, going and seeing things. I studied in central London. I went to school in central London, and we had a fantastic art teacher called Kate Miller, and she used to take us to the National Gallery every week, twice a week sometimes, because it was just a walk up the road. And so I studied history of art with her, but also art as well. And we used to go in, and during the day you would have people regularly. They would set up their easels and they would copy the old masters. And so I sort of had this around me, you know, growing up. And I think when I look back, there was something lovely about the way we would go, was because we would go and look at one work. So you didn't have the pressure of going, oh, right, I'm going to a museum or a gallery and I need to have a look and get the most out of this. It was just the sort of luxury of going along and just having a look at one thing. And in fact, of course, that's not easy to do with museums being expensive now. But I mean, some are free, and if you're close, it's just a lovely way to appreciate it. So I had that. So I was very interested in art. In fact, I was thinking of becoming an artist before I went into the film business, and that was a close run thing. And then, where I grew up in Islington, there were quite a lot of other people into music videos, things like that. I actually grew up with the well-known film director Joe Wright, also Adam Smith, who did the visuals for the Chemical Brothers, who are known for their visuals, and they used to come in to me all the time. So I worked on all of their early stuff, and for many years the visuals for the Chemical Brothers, and that moved on, and that was very experimental kind of filmmaking. They took their cue really from work that was done in the 60s, that was done in sort of digital art, but that hadn't really been thought of again. And so they were really sort of pushing into new areas. So I was very involved with them in that. So that evolved. And then in the lockdown, I picked up my paintbrush again and got back into it in a big way. And now I can't put it down. So, and one of the things I've been doing actually is sort of trying to, well, from that early experience of seeing people copy old masters, I've been working on a few myself as well, just to really understand what it must have been like, you know. So anyway, that's what I enjoy doing, certainly.
And maybe segueing from that, you've spoken already about that you were involved in like films and documentaries, and yeah, I think one of the things you worked on was at the time anyway. And I would say still very important, arguably the first history of art series on television that was aimed at the lay person, if I might say. Kenneth Clark's Civilization. He wrote a book about it. I think when people revisit it, it can be seen through a contemporary lens as quite controversial and a little bit patronizing. But can you say something about what you thought of, you know, just tell us a little bit about your experience of being involved with Kenneth Clark's Civilization. It's a BBC series about the history of Western art.
I wasn't involved in that. I was involved in the more recent one, which was about because I mean, okay. I may not look, but I was just a small boy when I
was going to say actually. So you mean the
Civilizations was a series.
Civilizations. I'm sorry, I stand corrected. Actually,
but you're not wrong in the sense that it was built as the sequel, so it was a huge budget production.
Yeah, I was going to say actually, it was ages and ages ago. So what a strange mistake! I just saw that and I thought, oh, Kenneth Clark, and you're in the art world, and I completely
sure
time travel.
Even I'm not that old. But,
there you go. I stand corrected.
Civilizations. So Civilizations was, I think, when was it? It's 2017, 2018.
Is this the one that had people like Mary Beard in it? And
exactly. So it had Simon Sharma, Mary Beard, and David Olasega.
Yeah.
And I was an edit producer, which is like a sort of writer on production on the actual show, and spent about 8 months making that show. So I spent time on all of the episodes actually.
Wow.
Yeah, going back to Kenneth Clark's civilization, without the S, they made a difference. I mean, that was a epic series. I mean, there were many programs. I mean, it was an exhaustive survey, really, of art and architecture. When they remade it, yes, obviously, I think looking back at the controversial nature of civilization meant that this time around, that had to be addressed. So that had to be part of the kind of the narrative, you know, to think about shifts, changes, what's happened. But what they kept consistent was that the episodes were very much personal stories. So Simon Sharma very much chose the art that he wanted to talk about. So did Mary Beard, and so did David Olusoga. And so you have very personal stories in terms of, you know, what they're choosing and what they care about, you know. So I thought two of the most interesting were Mary Beard's, which was, one was called How Do We Look, I think it was called, and it was really sort of taking off from the Berger idea of, you know, of how we see things and the male gaze, and so it was really from her perspective, and thinking about that in quite a modern way. She did another one which was about religion, which was fascinating, you know, very much to do with, you know, with graven images, as it says in the Bible, you know, sort of, and there were some fascinating places that were visited to try and understand the narrative, because I mean, on the one hand, in the Islamic world, you can't obviously show the prophet, whereas if you go to India, you know, there's still a huge tradition of manufacturing, you know, gods and effigies, and so, you know, it was being able to juxtapose those. I think it really, you know, brought home, you know, what's happening in the world around us right now. So there was lots about it.
Sorry, presumably the title Civilizations put the S on deliberately with a reference back to Kenneth Clark's Civilization without an S. It's as though Kenneth Clark said there's only one civilization, which is Western. I seem to remember one of the controversial things he says, I'm not going to look at anything from Spain because they've contributed very little to the history of art. That was one of many controversial things he said. But civilizations, it's a little bit like now we study art histories, not art history.
Yeah, sure. I think that was the age of the sort of the great man theory, wasn't it? That you know, that there were sort of heroic figures that pushed history forwards. But yeah, obviously that's been reassessed. So yeah, so civilizations, yeah. So yeah, and they were all very different. I mean, David Olusoga is a historian; he's not an art historian. So it was interesting to see his point of view as well.
Yeah.
And he started in the British Museum, you know, in front of a lot of the Benin works, you know, questioning why these are still here in front of us now, you know. So good, you know, get the debate rolling right from the start. But it was a great, enjoyable program to work on. I mean, it was very big budget. The photography was stunning, of landscapes, but also of the works themselves. So it was absolutely beautiful. I see it's still on. I mean, I'm, you know, it's not for me to advertise the BBC.
Is it on iPlayer? Is it on BBC?
Yeah, I see it on iPlayer. Yeah. And
so listeners should look that up and watch a couple of them, particularly the ones that Sebastian sort of honed in on there. And Veronika, almost at the other end of the scale in some ways, you became an editorial photographer, which, as you've already mentioned, in the United States. And can you say something more about the experience of photography for you, and then how maybe from that you turned to an academic study of art history?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I went to America in 1998, right after I'd say about 3 days after finished my MAs. And even though, I mean, at the time I got offered to do a doctorate in musicology, I was just like, you know, but then, you know, I'm not going to see the world. So I decided to go, and I landed a job at the Czech embassy as a business attaché, because I did have sort of a business experience, because I worked as a sort of office manager for a company that was sort of putting in the second mobile telephone network in Czech Republic. So, you know, based on that, not really with my MAs, they hired me, and I, you know, that was the first time I started working databases and companies, and so that was something then really helped me now when I started working with the AMR as a researcher. But anyway, I became embassy photographers, and I also befriended photographers that lived in Washington, D.C., worked on a Hill, did political photography, did editorial documentary. I was assisting a lot. And then at some point, after about 3.5 years at the embassy, I said, okay, I'm going to go and just be a photographer, which was really nerve-wracking, but I didn't have a family, so, it was okay. I had a work visa through a friend of mine who had a photo studio whom I work with. So that covered that. And then I was a member of the National Press Photographers Association, went to sort of different conventions, conferences, went to meet editors. And I did meet editors from the New York Times, Washington Post, and lots of other publications. And I started getting calls. And I think the reason why I was kind of interesting is that, well, it was still very much male-dominated world. I had a different point of view, A, as a female, but B, as a sort of foreigner who was in America, but still everything was quite new. It was really multicultural. Czech is not really, it's becoming now, but it wasn't. So I think it was that sort of happy meeting of, they wanted somebody to look at, let's say, there was a lack of teachers. So there are a lot of Filipino teachers coming to the United States to teach. And I did a long story for Washington Post about how they live, how they teach, what their lives are like. So I was sent to photograph a lot of stories like this, with lots of sort of immigrants, but also, more hard-hitting stories like, soldiers coming from Afghanistan, severely, injured, legs amputated. So I've met a lot of joy and a lot of misery. So
And
the photography took me.
Is this something you're looking at through the lens? This is like a photojournalism that you're involved in, yes. Or are you writing the copy as well as photographing, or only doing?
So I was working with writers. When I worked for the American publications, I mostly work with the writers. But then I also started publishing in a Czech press, and I was writing text to go along with my photograph. So I've sort of had these two things going on together. I worked for a lot of magazines, so I did the sort of editorial, sort of documentary photography, as well. But at some point I was thinking, okay, well, this is great, but maybe I really want to focus on things that are meaningful to me. And one thing that really interests me since I was a child is to understand what is the sort of nuclear threat, or how this sort of how this nuclear culture developed. So in 2009, I went to the Trinity site, which is where the first atomic bomb was exploded in 1946. And that sort of started a 10-year project, I should say, which spans sort of documentary photography, but also very abstract, and basically creating scientific instruments, which basically took me to study PhD. And this is the theme I was basically exploring. So I was offered to do PhD at one of the Czech universities. Benefit is I don't have to pay as a Czech citizen, so that was really good. And I have to say that research was very tricky because there was no framework for it. I had to sort of, there was not much established around this theme. I did manage to find a group which is associated with the Arts Council, and which is a sort of nuclear culture research group, which is led by Al Carpenter, who is still teaching at the Goldsmith University, but she's got other engagements in European universities. So that helped me to do, part of the research. But yeah, so that's how I sort of segued from being a documentary photographer into sort of exploring themes much more in depth. And And that's yeah. That's
Do you have any kind of website where listeners could view some of your work?
Absolutely, yes.
So we can put it, if you tell me after the podcast, so you can put it in the links, because I'd really like to look at some of that myself. It sounds really, really fascinating. And I grew up very much with the nuclear, the Cold War nuclear threat. We were terrified. I remember the CND marches and all that stuff. So it's quite weird, actually. I sometimes think, my son is aware of it. He's very interested in Cold War and politics and so on, but they don't seem to have the fear that I had in my generation. And we really thought that this could happen. And it seems to me that those nuclear weapons are still there. And we've got now what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. And they were there then, and yet for some reason people aren't. It's not top of the agenda of what people are that worried about. I find that quite strange. The way the lens shifts all the time, and they're probably will. Having said that, we're probably now going to have a moment when, some Ukrainian nuclear power station gets hit or something, and then we all realise how awful this can be. So Sebastian, coming on now to, we're actually 45 minutes into the podcast. I think I have to put a time mark on this. I think a lot of our listeners will be also looking forward to hearing you talk about both of you talk about the art market research site, and which is what you mainly work on at the moment, I think. You've already spoken about growing up in a family where your father was already interested in art prices. I suspect he was surrounded by sales, what was it called, the Art Sales Index, which used to be a hard copy, then kind of went online as well. But Robin Duthy, your father, he famously founded, I think it was in 1976, was it? You take up the story about AMR.
Yes, so my father, Robin Duthy, he worked in the city actually for a few years and decided to move across to the art market. This was back in the 70s, as you said. And no one really had taken that step. And the reason that he was interested was because he was passionate about art and artifacts, antiquities, anything. If he walked past a gallery, you'd have to walk in and have a look and pick things up and talk about things. And so he cared deeply about the stories, really, of each piece, and would talk forever. He used to get a bit frustrated when it came onto price. So when he said, okay, and how much is this? He sort of felt that, I think he felt that there was an imbalance, so that he just didn't have any information on it. It's a bit like going to a car dealership with a car and you don't know anything about cars, and so he sort of felt, well, what can I do to kind of, give people an opportunity to sort of understand, the history and how prices work. And so he embarked on his first book, which was called Alternative Investment. And that book had the first indexes. So he compiled charts on prices, and also gave an insight into the market dynamics and what drives prices, something about why people love it as well. And so it was a very sort of holistic approach. So it wasn't just about the data, it was about, what do we need to know really to get involved in this market and to really build the confidence really to make decisions. So he did that, and then he expanded a few years later to, it started in alternative investment was Collectibles. In the 1970s, that was 25 years after really the art and collectibles market started growing. It had reached a crescendo actually, and people were starting to see things were very valuable. So it made sense to write about it as well. There was definitely a market who was interested, lots of people had attic finds back in those days. There was lots of things that people never thought twice about the value. And then that was a big success. I mean, it sold in huge numbers. And then eventually he moved on to talk about art and painting as well. And in 1986, brought out another book, The Successful Investor. And that was the first to look at paintings and prices coming from the auction houses. So, I mean, I suppose he was following in the tradition of Reitlinger in the sense that he was actually putting prices down in the book and trying to make sense of it for people, take away the mystery from it. So that was successful, and then he developed the indexes. So then from taking these charts that he created in the book, then he decided to set up a business that was based around the indexes and work with the London School of Economics to develop the first indexes. Now, this was a brand new methodology that was designed for the art market. So really was looking at the different kind of intricacies of the art market and how you can quantify that. And so that was launched, and then that ran for 10 years in the Daily Telegraph as the Daily Telegraph Art 100. And then, so that was into the 90s, but it was also run by the major broadsheets, FT, regularly in the Lex column, you would find it. And then in 2001, the dot-com boom, for those of you old enough to remember, that was the first kind of when people were incredibly excited about the internet. It was still quite clunky then, you know, there was dial-up connections, things like that. But he took the bold step of creating this app. So not only did he have a website, but it was a functional one, so you could interact with. So you would go online, you would call up a chart, and you had certain things you could do. You could change the price bracket, so the interquartile range you're looking at, you could look at it in different currencies, all the things that we still have today. So, I mean, he was really ahead of his time in terms of, you know, this was 22 years ago, 2001, when this was launched. So yeah, so I mean, he was a real trailblazer in that way, and he inspired quite a few other people since, really, in the second wave around that time, to come from the city to the art market and to start to think seriously about, you know, art, the metrics of, you know, that can be had out of prices. So I mean, he was a real pioneer in you know, in ensuring people really take this seriously, and realizing that we need to sort of look at prices in the whole, in the round. You know, so yeah, so that was it. And then that was very popular. He built up a big client base, and then in 2015 I took over the business, and so I've been deeply involved in it since then. So you know, that's what I spend my time doing now. And I realized that, you know, I mean, we had worked together, actually. Many years ago, I had done a TV pilot for him when he was looking to expand into doing a sort of TV version of it. So I was very, you know, closely entwined with what was happening. And, you know, that was always our discussion. And then, so eventually it sort of made sense for me to come on board. And then, yes, as I say, I took over in 2015.
Yeah, and that whole history of, it's, I often say to prospective students at interview, when they say, what is this course really about? I say it's really about the relationship. I've had to choose one thing. It's about the relationship between cultural and financial value. Some people call it symbolic and financial value. And quite often I've taken students down to say Sotheby's preview, and I've hidden the label with the estimate on, and I've said to them, look, any of you who've worked in the art market, I don't want to answer, but any of you are coming from pure art history, how much would you pay for this work? And at first, people are widely wrong. But the more you do this, the more you begin to develop an instinct. And I guess what your dad was doing and what you're doing now is you're quantifying that more. We've got a lot of that data, and we understand, therefore, more about that relationship, what something is likely to be worth. I think the thing that still makes it very interesting is watching auctions, because I do this thing. Anders Pettersson, who is an example, I think, of someone who might well have been inspired by your dad to leave. I think he was with Bloomberg and left the city and came into the art market with Art Tactor. He's been a guest on the podcast earlier. He runs this game called Art Forecaster. So you have to he takes like 8 to 10 works from different auctions, and you have to choose which price band the eventual price is going to fall in, and it's a competition. There's a league, and I was watching it yesterday. And as an example to our listeners, this was a modern and contemporary Asian art sale at Christie's, I think it was. Before Christmas, I'd looked at all the indices and prices, to estimate what the eventual price is going to be. I thought these are all totally undervalued. You know, they're all going to go for way above. So I was doing the maximum amount all the time. I got like 0 points. I was totally wrong. And then yesterday I was much more cautious and it went the other way. So I ended up getting 1.5 out of 8 correct, but then no one else got them correct either. So that, I think that's an example of how there are externalities involved, that maybe these people who are collecting or buying Asian art, something must have happened. I remember it was during Diwali, so I thought that it would be even better. But maybe what was happening is people weren't thinking about buying art because it was Diwali, whereas yesterday they were all up for it. So that's what's so it's really interesting tension between this data that you can't argue with, which is because the auction prices are all published, that your dad used and you're still using, and yet there's always this anomaly of you can never quite work out what's going to happen in the auction. But you can. I remember Ernst Gombrich in his fantastic book Art and Illusion, as opposed to the more famous Story of Art. I remember he once said art history is about narrowing the areas of misunderstanding. And I think you knowing how to use like your database and other art price index databases, it's one of the tools we use to say, well, let's try and rationalize this as much as possible. And then if there is an anomaly, we might be able to think about why that might be. It might be some externality. The collapse of the Lehman Brothers on the morning of the Damien Hirst Beautiful Inside My Head Forever sale didn't seem to have an effect on people spending money. But anyway, going forward from that, do you want to say a little bit more? Maybe both of you could talk about this, about since you took over, and both of you were already working for AMR, for Robin at that point, but since you took over, what new developments have you made on the site?
Shall I say? Yeah.
Okay.
Either of them. Yeah.
Okay.
And then Veronika, I'm going to ask Veronika more about her interest in AI and emerging technologies as well. So whatever. But if maybe Sebastian more about what's happened in the recent years.
Well, so when I took over, I mean, we spent some time making the website much more interactive, so it's much easier to use. It's sort of got more of a haptic feel. Beforehand, you would have to load in exactly which artist and which price bracket, and then it would come up on screen. And we realized that actually with charts, what you need to do is you need to see the chart. You need to make your adjustments, look at different price brackets, different currencies, and as you start to move and see them change, you start to build a relationship with that chart in the sense of building confidence. And this is something I will go back to over and over again. You know, art market metrics, it's all about your relationship in terms of feeling confident about what you're looking at.
Actually, Sebastian, sorry to interrupt. Do you have a screen you could share to show this, or to show listeners? Because I'm aware that this is a subscription database. You can go to the site and have a look at quite a lot. But I don't know whether you want to. Yeah, let's share the screen and you can talk to it.
Log on.
You want to log on?
Yeah, if you want to log on.
Okay.
And it's a very different graphic from what it used to be with your dad, where it was more, I think, of a linear thing, and now you've got all this kind of, rather quite aesthetic sort of looking graphs.
Okay, so we're just getting it up so we can show you.
Show how this.
So going back to one of the things you said about the anomalies. In fact, any statistician will tell you that as soon as you see a huge swing or a big change in a chart, that's the point at which you have to go back and start to understand exactly what observation is causing that. And so it's a great way of immediately having a broad picture of what's been happening to a certain artist or group of artists, and immediately trying to understand about the important events. So can you see the screen now?
Yeah, you might. Have you opened up a new window? Because you'd have to stop sharing and then go back and open the new window.
Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, yeah.
I think this is that was a PowerPoint probably we were looking at.
Yeah, right,
so if you share screen again and find the window with the live site.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is the the web page here. We've already gone into, so you would have had a web page, sorry, a website landing page, and then you can actually get to your account once you have a subscription here, and then you create an index. And so this is the app where you can create thousands of, I can call up thousands of different indexes. So I can either browse from a list of indexes. We carry not just art, but we carry antiques, collectibles, furniture, jewelry, watches, cars, you know, huge range. So if you know what you're looking for, you can browse for it, or you can search. So common search is Andy Warhol. We have Andy Warhol for his paintings or his printmaking. Let's take a look at his paintings. So this is a chart looking at Andy Warhol paintings sold at auction since 1975. So I should say at this point that you know, we can come on to methodologies in more detail, but I think the important thing to know is that there are different index providers. We are one, but we stand out, as I said earlier, as having a methodology that was built specifically for the art market. And one of our main beliefs is that we once you gather the prices, you want to present those prices to our customers. So we don't want to do any adjustments or anything, you know, any kind of modeling of the prices. Because we believe that, I mean, like you say, the best thing is to go to an auction. If you go to an auction, you will see people sitting in the room, taking notes, writing down prices. Those, on the whole, will be dealers. And so, you know, that's what our clients like, is that basically that's what they're getting. They're getting effectively being in the room, but obviously not just in one room, but in all the key rooms at all the major auction and sales around the world. Every month. And so that is what you are looking at. So if you were able to do that and you make a note of Andy Warhol prices, that's what you would see. I think Andy Warhol is quite an interesting one, because obviously, you know, the media noise around Andy Warhol is that his values just keep going up and up and up. And actually, we've seen that, you know, he reached a high back in 2016. And then we start to see him go up here. Well, if I look closer, I can see that the chart's starting to move up in around May, which was the Marilyn Shot Sage Blue last year. I think it was what was the most expensive painting last year, one of the most expensive ever. And so that we can start to see why the index is going up. That will certainly would have had a big impact on the index. So if I go up, I can look at the central 80% and I could look at central 50%. So that's taking off some of the outliers. And we can already start to see that the individual piece, really, the extraordinary outlier that is Marilyn Shot Sage Blue might have had on the index. So that's just an example of, you know, of now, you know, because I'm actually, you know, the fact that I'm actually doing this, you know, makes me think more carefully about what I'm really looking for. And so it was this belief really is to try and engage people with art market metrics. And so not only is it there immediately and I can make changes straight away, but I can also start to build my own confidence around what I'm seeing. So yeah, so this was what we did first. Really was to really, yes, turn it into more of an experience for our customers. Since then, we've you know, we've got a broad range of things that we're working with. So we produced in 2020, we produced a report on handbags, which was the very kind of popular when it came out. You know, it was all the talk. Everyone wanted to write about luxury handbags, and obviously we were really well placed to look at prices. You know, having the experience of the of how to quantify, you know, a market like this, but also because Christie's had taken it on, you know, as a category that they were really fully invested in, and you know, we track the top auction houses, so it made it possible for us to think about it in those terms as well. So yeah, so we launched this. This was very successful. A lot of interest around this, and we still currently update prices on our handbag index. And then last year we moved on to Rolex. So we looked at Rolex. That was another sector of the market that has been booming for quite a while, actually. So we looked in detail at 1,000 individual Rolex prices. Yeah, so that's a detailed look at, and also to create a new index as well. So it was really a report analyzing, the whole market. So you're looking at not just a price index, but you're looking at the size of the market, the key players, average spend, things like that. So it's a really broad picture. Also, of course, because our business goes back a long way, that my father used to write about watches and all sorts, because he was a journalist as well. So he would write for lots of different publications, from FT to the Connoisseur. There's fabulous archive from his time and what it was like back then in the 70s and 80s at auctions. So it's always nice to be able to bring that in as well, so that you can start to see something of the historical context, which I think is very much part of how we see ourselves. Again,
we've been looking at you're looking at like luxury handbags and Rolex watches, and your choice of Andy Warhol as an artist you were showing. But one of the reasons why our program subscribes to your database is because one of the really interesting things it does, which Art Price, which is another of these indices, and we might talk a little bit about their methodology. They will occasionally show an index for, say, Impressionism Modern. But what is really good about AMR is that you can actually create, and you will tailor-make indices. I remember I once asked you to do one for St. Ives artists for me, or emerging women artists and that sort of thing. So you're also getting sectors. You can actually look at indexes for sectors, not just for individual artists. As I understand it, Art Price, because I use that as well, it tends to be, they will do individual artists. Their data only goes back to 2000, whereas yours goes back to the 70s because of the work your dad had done. So there are differences in between these databases, Veronika and Sebastian. But maybe you could talk about the difference between your methodology and, say, that of Art Price.
Do you want to show the other slide?
Which one?
This slide. Do you want to show this?
No, well, let me just start. I'll get on to the methodologies. Well, you've mentioned Art Price. They have an index. They have one called yes, we can put it up, actually. I see what you're saying. Sorry, we'll share the screen. I've got a slide that actually compares our indexes, which actually I thought was the bottom one here. So I put together really a comparison with ArtNet and Art Price. Now, the Art Price 100, as I understand it, that's their kind of blue chip index.
Yes.
And then ArtNet Fine Art, that I believe is contemporary, modern, impressionist grouped together, but don't quote me on that. But anyway, it is their kind of their definitive index, the tracking the kind of the most valuable end of the market. The AMR All Art, this is ours. So this was something we also introduced back in 2019. Which really is it's kind of a survey of our database, actually. So this index thinks in terms of sampling, the auction houses rather than the individual artists, and I can come on to why that is. But effectively, all of these indexes are trying to look at the top end of the art market in global terms, and so I think that. Actually, I've highlighted the key lockdown period here because I think that actually it's quite telling of the different methodologies. So what's happened in the lockdown in spring 2020, as everyone started to realize that draconian measures would need to be taken to deal with this virus, everyone closed shop. We were waiting to hear what was happening in terms of when people could open up again. Actually, auction businesses were some of the best placed to deal with some of this because of the investment they had already done online and live stream auctions. Nevertheless, if you look at the number of lots sold, the lots sold went down considerably in that period. So although the auction houses moved a lot of sales online, they weren't actually selling nearly as much as they had in previous years, or to the same value. And one of the reasons is that people certainly with bigger ticket works were waiting for better times. I mean, this is something that people always do in the auction business. I mean, you don't, unless you have to, you wouldn't sell your work of art unless you felt that it was a very good time to sell it. And so this was obviously a time to sort of to hold back. Certainly when you're dealing with very valuable artworks, or whether it's gems or watches, you need to be face to face with advisors. You need to be showing it to people who might be interested, and you can't do that for the bigger ticket items. And so that's what we saw. We certainly saw the top ends really come to a big slowdown around that period. And you can see that reflected in our index. So as I said earlier, we are basically in the room. So what you're seeing there is you're seeing that the average values of artwork going through the doors of the auction houses has gone down. And we can understand exactly why, for the reasons I said. Well, now you look in comparison to ArtPrice and ArtNet, analysts, they wouldn't disagree with what I've said. They know as well as I do that the number of big ticket works went down, and yet their indexes keep going up. Now, the reason is because they employ a methodology, again, don't quote me, but as I understand it, they use what's called hedonic regression. So you'll know this, David, but to try and keep this simple, no, I mean, that's fine on that, actually. I'd stick it. Oh. Yeah, okay, we can do that. I had some slides earlier here. So hedonic regression, it tries to imagine what would a world be like where all the artworks by Damien Hirst, for example, were the same. Because if they were the same, that would be great, because then you could track like for like, apples for apples, and you would have,
shots for shots. Just for the benefit of people only listening, not looking at the YouTube video, there's a great image. Did you paint this, Sebastian?
Yes, that's correct. Yes,
it's fantastic. So it's got the shark of formaldehyde by Hirst and a picture of Damien Hirst with one of his woolly hats on. And basically, the subject matter is the shark of formaldehyde, and Damien Hirst has got an arrow with reputation on it. And this is to illustrate this thing that Sebastian's explaining, hedonic regression. So carry on.
Yeah, so each artwork has specific characteristics. So, for example, the shark was a huge work. The size of the piece is important. People care about size. Subject matter, that's important. Perhaps shark is slightly alarming, and that could be good for some people, bad for others. But again, these are factors that people think are important that apply, contribute to why something sells for a certain amount of money. And so then the idea of hedonic regression is then to kind of strip away these kind of special characteristics until you come to a sort of hopefully equilibrium price between different works. In fact, they call it characteristic free. So you're sort of denuding it of its specialness. And then once you've done that for all those artworks, you're constructing indexes, with prices of these different characteristic free prices. So literally what's happening is the hammer price is actually being adjusted according to these criteria. Now this methodology actually came from the housing market, and it was also used in the car market. So it's a much older methodology than ours, and people used it for the art market because they felt that it was analogous. Well, as I explained earlier, my father, when he went into it, looked at it carefully and felt that that wasn't helpful. So if we go back to the chart, so to explain the chart, we're looking at the all art compared with the ArtPrice 100 and the ArtNet Fine Art. Clearly, you can see a dip around the lockdown period in the all art, but not in the other two. And so the reason is, as I've explained, because you are not actually looking at what's being sold on the market, but trying to sort of triangulate into a value, you end up, you know, with an index that's tracking the market, but it's not tracking market sentiment in the way that we do. And in fact, there are papers on this, you know, where they go into quite detail about the characteristic free, and also the way that, you know, one of the drawbacks of this methodology is that you are divorcing the, you know, your metrics from the actual market sentiment. So I think that's probably the nicest way I can illustrate it, actually. You know, there's a lot of discussion about in the industry about correlation, and there's a sort of general belief that the art market does not correlate with the other financial markets. And obviously this is a, you know, this would be a very nice scenario, because it means obviously that it's worth investing in art when things are going belly up elsewhere. And you know, we would argue that I haven't really seen this lack of or low correlation. In fact, we've certainly seen events where there's definitely a correlation with the financial markets and the world around us. And perhaps we should think more in terms of, you know, lead times or the different lag times and between the two, really, to try and understand the relationship. As I say,
so just if you could maybe go back to that previous slide where you're just to talk about your methodology about repeat sales, because I don't think we've really explained that. So you've got the hedonic.
Yeah, so repeat sales.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So repeat sales. That's famously was used by a index called May Moses, which was bought by Sotheby's several years ago. Again, this is different to ours. This is the perhaps the third, you know, sort of, you know, methodology that people are accustomed to, or certainly will have encountered in the market. And this is really like for like sales. So this is actually tracking exactly the same artwork that's sold more than once. And so, you know, that really is ideal in one sense, that you know that you are tracking exactly the same work and you're comparing apples with apples. The drawback with that is that there aren't that many what they're called pairs of sales to track, and so therefore any statistician will tell you that the more observations, the more robust the data. The statistical analysis.
Sorry, what I was going to say is the other problem with that, in my experience, is that, you know, someone buys, say, this. We're looking at Sebastian's drawings of two Marilyns by Warhol, and basically what he's saying is that one is sold at auction, say in 2015, then it comes up for sale like last month, and you're looking at the difference in price. It could go up or down, maybe allowing for inflation. Another problem there, Sebastian, as you know, is that, you know, why was that person reselling it? And there's a lot of sentiment that if something is resold too quickly, it often is bought, it often fails to sell because it doesn't make it very sexy. You know, why is this person getting rid of something that they've only just bought? People can often, it doesn't always work like that. And we know that a lot of people just need liquidity and people will then see it as a bargain. But, you know, there's all sorts of externalities that can affect that repeat sales. So could you talk about what AMR uses?
Yeah, so our methodology, as I say, the best way to think about it is if you were, so this is our all art index. So this is tracking the market here since 2007. And we collect data from the top auction houses, the top 22 auction houses and the major auction centers. And we use that data to construct our charts. And we apply what's called a moving average. So that's one of the most basic statistical methodologies you can apply to a set of observations. And really what all it's doing is it's trying to identify the signal and take away some of the noise, what's called noise, perhaps outliers, things are, you know, to try and understand the trend. So, you know, our index is really looking at what's actually happening, the behavior of collectors in the market around certain artists. And ours are particularly excellent for looking over long-term horizons. I think if you saw the Warhol index that I brought up, that it was reasonably spiky, that index. Certainly that's interesting from one perspective. What do those spikes mean? You could look in more detail to try and identify what those sales were, but also you could look at the kind of the trend over a long period, so that if you were to draw a trend line, or a exponential trend line, you would start to get a sense of the trajectory. So in that of growth or decline of the artist, and in those terms, really, you're looking at the y-axis on the left, and you're thinking in terms of how much it's gone up over a period or how much it's gone down over a period. And you're confident that really what you're looking as to what's been going through the sale rooms. Again, no prices are adjusted. And so that's why our clients are people, often art market professionals, who can't, don't have the time to go and sit in the auction rooms, and they know what they're looking at, and they know that they're getting, verbatim what's happening. So that's how we are different, because we're the only people that do that. We don't make any money from any ancillary services. So if you look at, say, ArtPrice and ArtNet, they have auction sites. I don't know their revenue model, but I know that ours, we don't gain any revenue from sales of art, and so we're able to maintain our independence in that way. And so we have no interest one way or the other. We are just interested in tracking the market as it changes.
It's really, that's really interesting. For people who are only listening to the podcast, this All Art Index, I think it's beginning probably. Is that in 2008? So it's starting. So the art market collapses in 2009, but it doesn't last very long.
No, 2000. Well, this actually is showing 2007. Actually, the data
2007. Okay, so 2007. Yep.
But it actually goes back to this is what we publish on the website from 2007, but the data is available to buy all the way back to 1978.
70.
We are actually, so this is the All Art. So as I say, this is all the works of art that we track. So it's really the best picture of global sales. But actually, we're just about to launch a new index called Top Traded, which is just looking at the most liquid sector of the market. Now, that's important because what you're seeing with the All Art also contains some extremely rare works of art. Botticelli recently, or you could name, or the Seurat last year that sold for over $100 million. That's probably the only Seurat that's out of an institution, and probably is the last time a Seurat of that quality will ever come on the market. And so inevitably, you can see on the right, if you have the screen, you can see how the art market has recovered after the pandemic. But it's very much thanks to some of these extraordinary works. And so we also want to be able to look at the market without those works as well. So we're tracking the market that has, the familiar names from Picasso to Warhol to Miro to Chagall, artists who were prolific in their lifetime. There's a lot of works out there. There's a lot of data around those sales, which gives people confidence in entering the market, buying something that they've got a good price history for. And those are the kind of the more liquid sector. Those are the things that trade regularly. And so we're about to launch that as well. And that shows a different picture to what you're seeing here. And I think illustrates that, there's different ways to think about the art market. I mean, auction houses want you to look at it one way, which is there are, fabulous sales that hit the headlines. But at the end of the day, the business of auction houses is bringing together buyers and sellers and trying to get as much as they can for the seller. And, and so it's not easy selling art. So it can't just be a simple story of Seurat selling for wonderful prices, and indeed it's not. So one index is never really going to give you a full picture of the market.
Would I be right in saying that, looking at this index, that if it starts at 2007, I think you said that your index arguably reflects sentiment more than the others do. So the argument here would be that we're starting in 2007 when the art market was nearly at its height from the new millennium. You know, it had been building up, hadn't it? And contemporary art sales have been doing amazingly. And then in 2008, I think the Damien Hirst sale is often seen as the final success. I remember the summer of 2008 was amazing. Things were just in all sectors were kind of at their height. But this suggests that the sentiment it doesn't suddenly dive down after 2007. It keeps growing in the early years.
Yes, I mean there is a dip there, and actually when you do the analysis, actually what was interesting is, you know, from an Asian perspective, they often describe it as a Western financial crisis. I mean, I know they were impacted, and I know that they had the same quantitative easing and things like that. And in fact, some of the money that the Chinese government pumped into China, I think, you know, plays a role in this, because you know, auction houses, the major ones, had been in Hong Kong for, you know, since the 80s, I think, or even earlier, and so they've been there a long time and had built relationships, and really this was an opportunity now to start to really work on those relationships. And I think there was a lot of Chinese antiquities and paintings that perhaps were in the Western part of the world, that they were taken back and they were sold to the Chinese market. At the same time, Chinese buyers were quite interested in, you know, iconic artists of the 20th century, just as Basquiat, Warhol, and Picasso are to us. In China, there are artists of the 20th century. It's very important, that were undervalued for a very long time, and they were starting to realize the value of prices there. And so, because this is a global picture, you're seeing, you know, that auction houses, really, is one way to look at it, is they are very, very good at adapting, and because of their global footprint, they're able to shift and change and adapt very quickly. And I mentioned before, they were very quick to adapt to the problems of the lockdown. So, you know, in that sense, yes, you know, there was certainly, if you look at the more liquid sector of the market, there was quite a big fall, in fact, of the kind of the day-to-day sales. And again, that's something you would expect to see. So, you know, I mean, you know, really, and so you'll see soon on our website, in the next couple of weeks, you'll see the new All Art with the new All Art Top Traded, and it's a family of indexes, so you'll be able to put them next to each other and really sort of interrogate what's happening with the two different indexes, and start to build a picture and understanding of, you know, what's been happening.
If you could stop sharing the screen at this point. What I was going to say is I'm very aware that we're now nearly at the 90-minute mark. I wanted to speak with Veronika about more of her interest and her more recent interests. I know she's very interested in AI, artificial intelligence, and its relationship with art and so on. But may I suggest that for our sakes and for listeners' sakes, that we maybe find another date where Veronika can come on, and maybe we can talk about AI and NFTs, that sort of stuff. I think that would be good. So apologies for maybe you've been waiting for that to happen, but I think it's probably more sensible. Do you agree that we'll do this as another podcast at some point?
I think it's a good idea, because Veronika knows so much about it. It's got fascinating insights, and it's something you could really just spend time on. I mean,
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, and I'm aware that, you know, Sebastian is he's the one that's grown up with his dad developing this index and so on. So obviously his voice was going to be heard more while we were talking about AMR. But I'm sure that if we do another one with Veronika, that she might have more to say about AMR from her viewpoint as well. So it remains for me to, yeah, we'll do that. I'll find a date, you know, sometime in the future where we can do that. So it just remains for me to thank you both very much, Veronika and Sebastian, for being guests today, and for speaking about this really interesting subject about how you can quantify the unquantifiable, if you like. Yes. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank
you very much. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.